Catherine, our discussion, I think it was almost 3-4 years ago, in Marfa, was kind of also a starting point for this exhibition. And also thank you to you, Thomas, who at that time organized this little exhibition in Marfa on Judd's view on ARP. And learning about the reviews of Judd in the late 60s early 60s on exhibitions he saw at Sydney Janis Gallery. A warm welcome to Carol Janis also. Where do I see him? And his there he is, and his wife. Was the starting point to reflect more thoroughly on the relationship ARP and the US, which was his most important market and a very important area for him in the late 50s and 60s. And we figured out that there's not a lot of research on this, as we found important relationship between him, American artist, his galleries in America, and also trying to figure out what impact these influences had on ARP and his late work also. And then the next time we met, you were talking about the exhibition the Nasher Sculpture Center is planning on ARP, which was a great joy for us because there hasn't been a large exhibition on ARP in America for a long time, and I think you're planning it for 2018. And Catherine Kraft herself is a very renowned Dada scholar and also an expert on abstract expressionism. And so it was a great joy to start going into a dialogue about these topics. And so we're very happy to have you here today from Dallas. And Engelbert, you were already mentioning the relationship between ARP and Nasher, and ARP being the very first sculpture his wife gave to Nasher. So it was the other way around, the emancipated way around, exactly, not. And so there's obviously a connection in beginnings between ARP and Nasher and the Nasher Sculpture Center. So it's wonderful having you beginning this art conference here today. Welcome very much, and it's all yours. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Loretta, and good evening. I'd also like to thank the Stiftung ARP for organizing this conference, which is such a great opportunity, and inviting me to speak, and also the American Academy for hosting us in this incredible location. I think all of the speakers have equally fallen in love with this place, and it will be very difficult to remove us from here after tomorrow. So. In March 1958, James Thrall Sobey, a curator at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, who was organizing a retrospective of ARP's work to open later that year, wrote to Marguerite Hagenbach, ARP's second wife, about the selection of works for the exhibition. Among the sculptures slated for inclusion was the large bronze human lunar spectral, just being completed in Switzerland and recently purchased by the prominent American collectors Burton and Emily Tremaine. Almost as an aside, Sobey noted in his letter, and in this connection, it might interest ARP to know that there is a small but extremely talented group of neo-Dada artists working in New York. I had a letter from Mrs. Tremaine just yesterday thanking me for calling her attention to a very young painter in the group, Jasper Johns. She bought a picture by him, I myself bought another, and the museum has acquired 3. I told Dr. Holbeck, that is Richard Hulsenbeck, about Johns too, but I haven't seen him since. Hans Richter was at the opening of Johns' show and greatly excited by the young man's paintings. Sobey was referring to Jasper Johns' first solo exhibition, which had just closed the month before at the Leo Castelli Gallery. As Sobey's remarks suggest, the astonishing success of this show was the talk of New York's art world. Johns' debut landed him on the cover of Art News, and as Sobey's letter indicates, brought the phenomenon of neo-Dada into public view. And you see here the table of contents, this little explanation of the cover, that Johns is the latest of the young Americans who have turned to a sort of neo-Dada, pyrotechnic or lyric, earnest but sly, unaggressive ideologically, but covered with aesthetic spikes, covering all the possible bases of what an artwork can be, really. The term neo-Dada identified young artists whose work appeared sharply at odds with the serious painterly and expressive concerns of abstract expressionism. First applied to Johns, Rauschenberg, and a few others, neo-Dada soon came to encompass a diverse range of art, including assemblage, installation, and performance, pop, early forms of minimal and conceptual art. In short, the explosion of experimental art forms ushering in the 1960s. My own research has shown that the term neo-Dada actually arose in New York in the art world in the early 1950s as a word largely used in conversation among initially artists themselves, and often as a kind of insult, a way of criticizing works that seemed on the one hand very far out, even destructive, and on the other hand derivative with apparent references to the past. Unlike Dada itself, neo-Dada wasn't used by artists themselves to identify themselves as a movement or a group. And in fact, most of them really disliked the term, or at best viewed it with bemusement. Johns himself, for example, has said that he didn't even know really what the term Dada meant until he heard neo-Dada applied to himself. Now, as Sobe's letter suggests, among Dada's original participants in New York, neo-Dada stirred much curiosity. Richard Holzenbeck not only visited Johns's exhibition, he too bought a painting. Marcel Duchamp, relieved to find a more cerebral form of art emerging to displace abstract expressionism, visited Johns and Rauschenberg's studios and attended early happenings. So it would seem that Arp's 1958 retrospective was coming at a perfect moment to enter into a renewed conversation with contemporary art. Yet Arp's neo-Dada moment never arrived. His exhibition, while well-reviewed, passed with little noticeable impact. He visited New York for the opening and saw old friends, but seems to have met few younger artists. And as curators, gallerists, and other observers adopted the term neo-Dada to understand a radically changing art world, they did so primarily by dividing artists associated with the label into two different camps, one influenced by the conceptual concerns of Duchamp and his ready-mades, and the others by the collage aesthetic of Kurt Schwitters. In contrast, Arp's presence in American art, and New York in particular, remains difficult to pin down, despite the seemingly pervasive impact of his work. It's not difficult to find evidence of Arp's influence on American artists, as this example kind of over-clearly indicates. But it's more revealing and perhaps more rewarding to inquire after its apparent absence, or at the very least, its elusiveness. In fact, a consideration of the impact and reception of Arp's work in the New York art world foremost reveals the inadequacy of terms like influence to speak of what are properly encounters, responses, aversions, even arguments with him and his work. Despite the critical and popular recognition afforded to Arp, I'd contend that his approach to creativity and to making art challenged American artists and their supporters and made his work difficult to assimilate to prevailing interpretations of modernism and artistic identity. Arp's work began to be widely shown in New York in the 1930s, and almost from the beginning, viewers were able to see a wide range of historical works dating back to the Dada period, as well as evidence of the artist's ongoing activities in the present. Like many modern artists, foremost among them Picasso, Arp had worked in a profoundly diverse array of styles and media over the course of his career. In the years of the Dada movement alone, he made completely abstract works, often in collaboration with his then companion, later wife, Sophie Teuber, collages created according to the laws of chance, loosely improvisational ink drawings, later deemed automatic, and painted wood reliefs. He wrote poetry, an activity that intensified during the 1920s in association with surrealism, when Arp focused largely on reliefs, drawing on the vocabulary of his poetic object language. And in the 1930s, he began making papier déchiré, collages of torn paper as well as sculpture in the round. As Arp's career progressed into the 40s and 50s, and until his death in 1966, he continued to work in three primary modes, all of which were regularly seen in the United States: collages, reliefs, and sculptures, supported by drawings and prints. Apart from the severely geometric works of the 19-teens, Arp's work was instantly recognizable for its flowing contours and organic forms, and indeed he was commonly recognized as a source of the biomorphic imagery favored by artists from the 20s through the 50s. At the same time, there were crucial elements of difference between his works in various media. Despite its seeming consistency, Arp's work prompted varied reactions, and artists were drawn or had aversions to distinctly different aspects of his work. So one of the first things that needs to be established when we talk about the impact of Arp on American artists or in the American art world is which Arp we're talking about. Inseparable from Arp's embrace of varied media was his rejection of what others held as a position of philosophical, even ethical purity. At a time and place when distinctions between abstraction and representation were becoming more and more polarized, Arp's refusal to choose one over the other and his ability to migrate effortlessly between, say, the Surrealists and Cercle Carré or Abstraction et Création was almost unique. Presentations of Arp's work in New York in the 1930s and 40s followed his lead, abstaining from definitively assigning him to one camp or another. In 1936, the Museum of Modern Art included him in both their landmark exhibitions, Cubism and Abstract Art, as well as Fantastic Art, Dada Surrealism. And when, in the early 1940s, Peggy Guggenheim opened her New York gallery, Art of this Century, Frederick Kiesler designed two different spaces, one for abstraction and one for surrealism, with art being one of the few to migrate seamlessly between the two environments. And this little piece here was owned by Peggy Guggenheim. And you see here on the left the abstract gallery, and there it is, right on top of that little hanging platform. And in the surrealist gallery, let me make sure I've got it in the right place. There it is, right up there. Arp's work was then thoroughly accessible to New York audiences. Just to mention the high points, which I've already started and I'm sure we're going to hear about in the course of the talks tomorrow. The Museum of Modern Art included a collage, two reliefs, and a sculpture in Cubism and abstract art, as well as more than 24 works in a range of media in Fantastic Art, Dada Surrealism, where indeed Art virtually introduces the show, being hung right over the information desk. In 1938, A.E. Gallatin presented a show of recent works by Arp, including reliefs, collages, and watercolors. And in 1944, Art of this Century, Peggy Guggenheim's gallery, mounted a small retrospective of his work with 26 works in a variety of media. And what you're seeing is one of the, on the left here is one of the only kind of semi-installation photographs taken for a photo shoot in Vogue while the installation is still going on. And the model's holding the brochure in which this element from, another work owned by Peggy Guggenheim, the heels of the shoe is flipped over and made into this form, which was perforated, so it could be removed and created a little negative space that is she's peeking through. After the war, Arp's work was shown consistently, first by Kurt Valentin and after his death by Sidney Janis, who had previously included Arp in the landmark 1953 Dada exhibition organized by Marcel Duchamp and visited by artists including Rauschenberg and Cy Twombly. As I've mentioned, Arp's biomorphic forms had a direct influence on untold numbers of artists in both Europe and the United States. Certainly the abstract expressionists were no exception. Although the influence of Miro has more frequently been recognized as a factor in their development, Art, too, is sometimes acknowledged, particularly in their early works. But this impact is usually described quite vaguely as a general tendency to use curving lines, for example, to enclose shapes suggestive of organic forms. In fact, by 1962, a reviewer for Art's magazine observed that no pair is safe from association with Arp's work. And he concluded that, in fact, the non-specific influence of Arp's oeuvre has been so pervasive that it's hard to imagine our culture without him. Rather than a diffuse overall Arp effect, though, what would happen if we think and look a little more specifically? When we consider works by Arp that such artists as Willem de Kooning, Arshile Gorky, or Jackson Pollock were seeing during their formative years in the 30s and also in the 1940s, the works were largely reliefs. Some 15 of them in fantastic art data surrealism, and also some 13 of the 26 works in the 1944 retrospective at Art of this Century. And I'd argue that Arp's reliefs in particular were important for these painters, for painters such as the abstract expressionists who were interested in the limits and possibilities of painting per se. Arp's sawed, screwed together, smoothly painted chunks of board interacted through sometimes ambiguous interplays of positive and negative forms, and were arranged in compositions that could appear provocatively, even awkwardly provisional. Sometimes their orientation was open to question. Various works could be hung upside down or sideways. This work in particular, we saw this element flipped over for the brochure. And in places, their painted surfaces and the actual underlying shapes of the wood contradict each other, with cleanly painted contours separating one color from another, disrupting the visual integrity of individual layered components. There are better examples in some of Arp's Dada collages, but here, for example, this red area and the orange area are actually just a single piece of wood. Oftentimes the areas of his reliefs, though, are divided, so it's very hard to tell what's a different plane and what's simply a different area of paint. So when we're thinking about Arp's reliefs, and we turn to the work of, for example, Gorky in his garden in Sochi, the curvilinear forms of this work reminded Gorky's friend, the artist and critic Elaine de Kooning, of Miro, but she was perplexed that the treatment of the painting surface wasn't like Miro at all. Instead, she saw what she called a reverse method of drawing, where a smooth, opaque layer of green covers an underlying composition, aspects of which are revealed through cleanly silhouetted shapes cut, and that's her word, into the green, generating a perception of actual depth in Gorky's handling of his materials. So she's talking about areas like this, where you have these very sharp, and if you see the actual painting, this green, the green paint is very thick and seems quite impenetrable. Gorky's treatment of these forms, the buildup of the surface, the interpenetration of cut forms, and the thick sleekness of the paint, suggests not the washy, often subtle grace of Miro, but instead the emphatic physicality of Arp's hybrid medium. As Gorky's garden in Sochi, with its play of presence and absence, seen and not seen, suggests, Arp's reliefs encompassed absence as well as presence. Prominent among Arp's in New York collections was the Museum of Modern Art's Mountain Naval Anchor's Table. At the time, here, let me go forward there. At the time, the play of positive and negative space arising from Arp's use of cutout forms was associated with Arp so strongly that it defined not only the brochure for his Art of this Century exhibition, which featured the cutout silhouette I've described, it was also a feature of MoMA's catalog for the 1958 show, and there's in fact correspondence about the sort of budgeting and where the resources for the catalog should be put, and it was decided that it was important to reproduce this work not only in color, but with these sort of cut-out forms made in the actual paper. Likewise, Jackson Pollock, in the midst of making dripped and poured paintings, created a small group of works in which positive and negative shapes formed figurative elements. In most cases, he cut these figurative shapes from painted pieces of paper and either attached them to another surface or backed the paper left behind with another support. And this is difficult maybe to see primarily because this image is unfortunately a black and white photograph. But this figure here, which is part of a drip painting, was actually cut out of this. So you have to imagine this being kind of the same palette of colors. This cutout, the positive cutout, was put down onto this surface, which Pollock then seems to have painted around. And this leftover with the sort of negative void in the middle, there's a couple of photographs of Pollock's studio where you see this work basically with nothing behind it. What you see photographed here is that it's been overlaid on this on another piece of paper that has some paint on it. These figures' contours and their tenuous position between positive and negative space and between figuration and abstraction are also reminiscent of Arp's reliefs, which shuttled between these modes without strenuously insisting upon a single solution. In another painting Pollock made around the same time, the addition of a found object, the actual wooden head of a child's toy horse, right here, creates a more decisive echo of Arp's reliefs. At about the same time as Pollock's experiments, Robert Motherwell turned to a different mode of physicality in Arp's work. As editor of the Documents of Modern Art, Motherwell became deeply involved with Arp's art and writings during his work for On My Way, a 1948 collection of the artist's writings, and for the 1951 publication, The Dada Painters and Poets, an anthology that was 6 years in preparation. In the early 1940s, almost alone among his peers, Motherwell began making collages. Initially, he attempted to address various aspects of political subject matter, as you see here. But later in the decade, his collages began to gain a new expressiveness and directness that were closely tied to these book projects. Motherwell had long been aware of Arp, but his editorial work brought him into close contact with the full range of his work, from the abstract collages he had made as part of Dada to more recent objects as well. In his Dada collages, Arp had aimed at an ideal of anonymous perfection. Around 1930, Arp had retrieved from storage a group of such collages for an exhibition, and he was shocked to discover that these so-called perfect works had been ravaged by the passing of time. Papers had buckled, glue had darkened and cracked, and in a new text written for On My Way, Arp described his reaction to this discovery. Quote, "What arrogance is concealed in perfection? Why struggle for precision, purity, when they can never be attained? The decay that begins immediately on the completion of the work was now welcome to me." End quote. Arp's impassioned outburst stressed the relationship between art and destruction in a way he had never done during his Dada years, and he responded to his discovery with the papier déchiré, collages made from torn paper that often included fragments of his own drawings ripped to pieces. He was still using this method in the 1940s, and Motherwell reproduced papier déchiré in both On My Way and in the journal Possibilities, which he also co-edited. The collages Motherwell made in the late 1940s, in turn, echoed Arp's preference for torn, uneven edges, their rough contours creating an impression of gesture, not often associated with the hard edges of conventional papier collé. In turn, the papier déchiré Motherwell selected for illustrations possessed similarly direct and vigorous qualities. But there were important differences in the artist's approaches. With the first papier déchiré, Arp gazed across more than a decade at the original impulses that had resulted in some of Dada's most radically distinctive objects. In these and the works that followed, He took time into his own hands, turning to actions generally associated with its destructive passage to generate new works. Arp's strategy acknowledged, even required, the active and inescapable presence of negating and destructive processes, but made ultimately therapeutic use of the inevitable, recouping the forces of destruction in an act of creation. In contrast, Motherwell's collages, as we see in here, the torn edge of the paper became the mark of the artist's presence, the collaged equivalent of a brushstroke. The identification between the torn and painted edge is particularly important to In Gray and Tan, the work on the right, where torn triangular-shaped pieces of mottled blue paper lie atop a similarly rough triangular form painted in pale blue stripes. This play between gesture and edge would prove decisive in the concurrent development of Motherwell's well-known elegy to the Spanish Republic, whose ragged forms arrayed across the picture plane echoed the torn papers of his collages. When we look at abstract expressionists' response to Arp, then we see a rather idiosyncratic focus on certain aspects of his work. His relief's provisional approach to composition, embodied in the obdurate hybridity of the physical forms, and in the papier déchiré, the recuperative possibilities of an otherwise destructive act, likely known to every artist, of tearing paper. That the abstract expressionists put these interests at the service of a deeply expressive, highly personal approach to art would likely not have been satisfying to Arp, who had spent much of his career seeking ways of working that diminished the artistic ego. It also proved problematic to many of the younger artists who began to emerge in the early 1950s, some, but not all of whom, would eventually be deemed neo-Dada. Around 1950, one of these artists, Robert Rauschenberg, and his then wife, Susan Weil, collaborated on a group of works made by exposing to light blueprint paper with people or objects placed atop it. The resulting prints were life-size, but Rauschenberg and Weil subsequently made a portfolio of smaller versions of the works, which you see here, by photographing and printing them at a reduced scale. Among the prints in this portfolio is the one down here, the only known blueprint work not to be based on the human body. And in fact, we know very little about this piece. Only one copy of it exists, and it's unknown how large the original actually would have been. But its loose grid of exposed torn paper reminded me instantly of these collages by Arp. The one on the left entered MoMA's collection in 1937. The connection seemed obvious to me. When I first saw Rauschenberg's and Weil's collaborative piece with the vagaries of exposure to light producing ghost images resembling the slightly darkened glue trails of Arp's collage. But I've since become skeptical of myself, skeptical of the association with Arp, primarily because of the title of this work, written in pencil down here at the bottom, which it's written by Weil, but according to her was provided by Rauschenberg. The title of their work is Fugue. Rauschenberg and Weil had studied with Joseph Alpers at Black Mountain College, the experimental arts school in North Carolina, just before and during making these works. And they certainly could have been introduced there to Arp's by then legendary method of generating a work of art by dropping squares of paper onto a surface. But the title Fugue also points us toward the work of Albers himself and a strain of abstract painting that its practitioners identified with music. Albers himself created a work called Fugue, and the title also pops up in the work of other artists, including Paul Klee, as I show you here. That doesn't rule out Arp, whose collages arranged according to chance had by 1950 attained near-mythic status. But there's no other evidence of his impact on Rauschenberg's or Weil's art. That could still surface, but this likely misreading does point up one key aspect of these particular collages and related works by Arp and Sophie Teuber Arp from this period. How adamantly abstract they are, how insistently they resist associative and metaphorical interpretations. Indeed, the mythologizing of the laws of chance, which were not associated with these works until considerably later, is in a sense compensatory. The placement of a narrative of process into the presumed vacuum of the work's non-objectivity. Certainly, chance was important to Arp, but not as an all-out, rigidly followed procedure. Understanding Arp's courting of chance in this way narrows and limits a process that for him appears to have been important for the freedom it offered. Freedom from ego and from being caught in one's own talents, habits, and expectations. The only American artists whom we can reliably say had an actual substantive exchange with Arp himself was Ellsworth Kelly. And it was centered on works like these and their association with the concept of chance. At exactly the moment when Rauschenberg and Weil were at Black Mountain College, Kelly was studying art on the GI Bill in Paris. He was introduced to Arp at a Hans Richter opening in the spring of 1950 and subsequently invited to visit his studio. He visited Arp on at least 3 occasions, showed him photographs of work in progress, and even asked him for a letter of recommendation for a Guggenheim Fellowship, which he unfortunately didn't get. At the time he met Arp, Kelly was looking for ways to create works of art that were neither composed in a conventional sense, nor focused on inner emotional experience, like as art in the US, with the rise of abstract expressionism, increasingly was. Later in the 1950s, when Kelly was back in New York and began showing work there, observers routinely identified as Arpish some of his swelling curvilinear forms, which were actually inspired by his observations of perceptual phenomenon, such as the play of shadows over the pages of a book, as you see here. Such casual remarkings of resemblance, though, miss Kelly's deeper engagement with Arp. There are, for example, the reliefs he made in Paris, photos of which he may have shown to Arp. The work's hybrid nature between painting and relief, their play of positive and negative space, and their adamant embrace of both abstraction and representational associations would have placed them squarely in the midst of Arp's own concerns, even if the actual inspiration for their forms arose from Kelly's careful observation of daily life. Arp's sympathy is apparent in Kelly's report of the visit in a letter to John Cage. When I visited Arp again, I showed him photographs of my recent work, which he liked, and said that I was courageous, which I don't quite understand. It was courageous for him in 1916, and for Mondrian and Kandinsky. Benefiting from their struggle, it is very natural today to continue. During Kelly's first visit, Arp showed the young artist his Dada chance collages as well as his collaborations with Sophie Teuber Arp and other works by her. To Arp's delight, Kelly was greatly taken with the anonymous quality, anonymous being Kelly's description, of Teuber's precisely arranged geometric units, but he also listened keenly to Arp's description of making collages by tearing or cutting up existing work and letting the pieces fall. And Kelly himself began experimenting with this strategy almost immediately in torn paper collages and paintings based upon them, as you see here, but also soon in a group of works in which he cut up an existing composition and reconfigured its elements according to chance. The works generated by applications of different kinds of chance were crucial to the development of Kelly's work. He found in these experiments an analog for the coherence nature presented, despite its overwhelming variety. Kelly observed, quote, "The leaves, grass, cracks in the wall, all the randomness of a million pieces and variations. This way of composing was endless and didn't need me. The works made themselves. It seemed nature worked for me using the laws of chance," end quote. Kelly's conclusion is impossible to imagine without Arp's example, even as Kelly put it into practice on a scale far beyond anything Arp ever attempted. One night, for example, Kelly had a dream in which he and some students were on a scaffold making an enormous wall painting composed of square sections. Upon awakening, he made a sketch, cut it into squares, then reassembled the squares by chance. He flipped the resulting collage, then painted it at an enlarged scale, resulting in Cité. And you can see here, this is the collage, like this sort of bar here ends up at the lower right there. And this very thin little slightly curved piece ends up here. Kelly further developed a grid system in which he determined how to fill each square of the grid by drawing from a box slips of paper with numbers corresponding to positions on the grid. This approach culminated in a series of collages composed of intensely hued papers, cut into squares, then placed in a grid by chance selections. These collages then became the basis for his color panel paintings, such as the magisterial Colors for a Large Wall. Kelly used the principle of chance in tandem with a range of decisions and choices to create a composition generated out of a sort of collaboration with principles found throughout nature. For him, as for Arp, there was no discrepancy between systems of chance and observations of nature. This connection between the two, between chance and nature, would lie at the heart of Kelly's later resistance to being labeled a minimalist, despite the recurring use of the grid in his work. As I mentioned, Kelly's visits to Arp's studio also provided him with an introduction to the art of Sophie Teuber Arp, and his enthusiastic response to Teuber's work undoubtedly endeared him to the older man. Since her death in 1943, Arp had become a tireless champion of her work, and his insistence on presenting their work alongside each other was one of the most confounding elements of Arp's presence in the New York art world. New York had its share of artist couples, but joint exhibitions between spouses were by no means common, and were indeed usually detrimental to the women. It goes without saying that same-sex couples such as Rauschenberg and Johns were never shown together with any acknowledgement of their relationship. A 1950 exhibition at the Sidney Janis Gallery presented the work of Arp and Teuber Arp side by side, as did a 1960 exhibition at the Galerie Chalette. Faced with the couple's collaborations, Arp's frank admission of Teuber's influence upon him, indeed his insistence on continuing their collaborations beyond her death through the use of prints and other works, and the paradox of what were seen as Arp's feminine organic forms, along with Teuber's so-called masculine geometric ones. Most reviewers scrambled to distinguish the works and the individuals from one another, and to preserve Arp's prerogative as a modernist artistic genius, consistently to Teuber's detriment. One astonishing review located Teuber Arp's weakness in her very independence from Arp's example. Still, there is a dialectic in the Chalette exhibition. One cannot help feeling that in Arp's own work, one is seeing the fruits of a rigor that must, to some degree, have been absorbed into his sensibility as the result of Teuber Arp's more disciplined and less fanciful outlook. Arp's poetry was not transmissible, and so this dialectic of two disparate natures makes itself felt for only one party to the equation. Arp was able to mingle these separate claims and make them nourish each other. Teuber Arp was not. Arp's collaborations with Teuber Arp share with his engagement with chance a willingness to undermine the romantic ideal of the solitary creator, an abnegation of authority that stirred admirers such as Kelly, even as it made other observers, like Kramer, deeply uneasy. And it was likewise with other aspects of Arp's approach to making art. For the abstract expressionist, expression was paramount. It was the torn gestural edges of Arp's papier déchiré, the intransigent physicality of his reliefs, that attracted them, not his desire to yield up artistic control through collaborations and the action of such natural forces as chance, and to give form to his visions by removing evidence of the artist's hand. To appreciate the relative lack of impact Arp's 1958 retrospective made on the New York art world, it's helpful first to consider how perceptions of Arp's work by New York audiences changed in the 1950s. During this period, the dominant presence of his reliefs in exhibitions began to be challenged by the increasing visibility of his sculptures, which were becoming more widely available as Arp gained the resources and collectors to have them cast in bronze, a practice he had scarcely pursued before World War II. Like his reliefs, Arp's sculptures displayed almost no facture marks or other traces of the artist's hand, but they manifested this quality in a very distinctive way. Arp tended to build up plasters by hand, finding the form of the sculpture as he worked on it. Then, after World War II, he would then usually turn the plasters over to master craftsmen to be cast in bronze or carved in stone. Although Arp stressed that his sculptures were formed by the human hand, their streamlined, flowing contours possessed a sort of formal inevitability, as if Arp's labors had only guided the object toward a perfectly natural conclusion. One reason it's been difficult to recover the early importance of Arp to the abstract expressionists is that, for the most part, they intensely disliked his sculpture. Especially when rendered in marble or gleaming polished bronze, the smooth, swelling forms of Arp's three-dimensional works struck the abstract expressionists as impersonal and even a bit disingenuous. Willem de Kooning's aversion was typical. At a panel discussion in the 1950s, he made the unlikely comparison of the pebble of Arp with the potato of Van Gogh, discounting the rhetoric of nature that was by then commonplace in discussions of Arp's work. But according to de Kooning, the potato seems like a romantic, that is, organic object. You can watch it growing. If you don't eat it, it's going to change, grow, rot, and disappear. A pebble is like a classical thing. It changes little, if any. If it was big, you could keep the dead down with it. To observers who valued process and expected to see visible indications of it, Arp's sculptures, unlike his reliefs and papier déchiré, and unlike potatoes for that matter, seemed shut off from experience, a closed circuit. And the phenomenon of neo-Dada did little to change things, as the works so christened tended, at least early on, to display the irregular contours and indexical traces that signaled the active presence of the artist. Arp's 1958 Moma Retrospective only heightened this impression by weighting its presentation predominantly towards sculpture. 49 were included in contrast to 32 reliefs, an imbalance reinforced by the sculpture's generally larger size and more emphatic physical presence. In a perceptive and largely positive review of the retrospective in Arts magazine, William Rubin, eventually to be a curator at MoMA himself, nonetheless noted that Arp's work was, quote, cut off, unquote, from recent developments in sculpture embodied by the work of David Smith, Richard Stankiewicz, and Louise Nevelson. That is, artists who made sculpture by manipulating materials rather than by carving or modeling. Although Rubin recognized Arp's early reliefs as antecedents of this tendency, the sculpture Arp had been making since the 1930s appeared, in Rubin's view, as a dead end for the history of art. He saw them as incapable of serving as a starting point for others. And what Rubin describes as the, quote, smooth, anonymous finish of Arp's sculptures, quote, unquote, gave away nothing of the artist's engagement with his materials. According to Rubin, in thus submerging the traces of the hand, Arp counters the main flow of modern art. Rubin assessed Arp's sculptures by means of their skin, not their structure. And this imbalance gives him no way to consider other aspects of his work, for example, Arp's adjustments of scale, especially what was by then becoming his common practice of enlarging sculptures, other than for Rubens to implicitly criticize them. Moreover, Rubens and other observers completely missed indications of other types of processes, such as Arp's practice of fragmenting plasters to create new forms, as you see here, and this was a work included in the show, where you have these very cleanly cut faces. Attentiveness to such processes would have revealed Arp's mind, if not his hand, at work. Even the uncanny smoothness of his sculptures likewise resulted from long processes of filing and sanding, perhaps to diminish the visible presence of the artist's hand, but also to create a surface that becomes one with the disparate and sometimes surprising forms that can emerge as one moves around these sculptures. At the beginning of my talk, I said that Arp's retrospective had virtually no impact on Neo-Dada, and I still stand by that, but I wouldn't say that it showed Arp to be, in Rubens' words, a dead end. Instead, we find in the early 1960s an incisive response to the very qualities in Arp's sculpture that Rubens found so problematic, and we find them from an unlikely source that you've already been introduced to this evening, the artist Donald Judd. In 1963, at a time when he was supporting himself by writing reviews, Judd visited an Arp exhibition at the Sydney Janus Gallery and wrote one of his characteristically terse yet incisive texts on the show. Judd's criticism ranged widely at this time, but his engagement with Arp was not limited to a single exhibition review. Although we don't know if Judd visited the 1958 Moma Retrospective, its catalog and other publications on Arp were in Judd's library until the end of his life. And also at the end of his life, in his last published essay, Judd reiterated his esteem of Arp. In his Spring Street home and studio in Lower Manhattan, a print by Arp still hangs in a small alcove just off the artist's bedroom. And what you see here is a little corner. I think this is actually a Stuart Davis print. There's an Arp, and it's right behind this wall. This is the top floor, along with a gigantic work by Dan Flavin that I hope Judd turned off at night. This print on the left, Multiple Fin 5, is a woodcut from 1956. Arp made a suite of them for a book of poems by Yvan Goll, which was never published in France, but in 1962, an American publisher issued a translation with Arp's prints. It's not known when Judd purchased this print. It's probably quite a bit later because he had no money at this time, really. It's thought to be one of the unsigned prints from the 1962 publication, but the intricate meanderings of the white lines over its black surface does have some affinity with Judd's untitled 1961 painting. In both, line unifies rather than divides the pictorial field, making distinctions between figure and ground deeply ambiguous. One of the pleasures of reading Judd's art criticism of the 1960s, in addition to its pragmatic wit and brusque intelligence, is the way it allows us to glimpse Judd's own concerns and struggles as a maturing artist. By the time Judd saw Arp's 1963 show, he had moved from making paintings to making reliefs and his first freestanding works. And Judd later recalled Arp as one of the only artists working in relief at that time. Judd was, at the time of the Janus show, just coming out of painting, yet seeking unity of form and experience through the physical and conceptual wholeness of the work of art. And he somewhat paralleled Arp's journey from the wall, with both experimenting initially with what we might call freestanding reliefs, these sort of planar works that come off the wall and they're sitting on the floor. They're these sort of hybrid objects. Judd might be the last artist we would expect to offer praise for Arp's work, trafficking as it does in representation and illusion. But in fact, Judd was perfectly capable of admiring artworks that differed enormously from his own. For example, the work of Lee Bonteque or Claes Oldenburg. And as critical and even hostile as Judd could be toward the European modernist tradition that in his view had substituted intellectual structures for direct experience, he saw something different in ARP. Judd's ARP review offers a striking instance of an artist at a transitional moment using his response to another's work to find language for issues of particular urgency to his own art. The Sidney Janis Gallery's ARP exhibition presented mainly works that had been made in the previous 5 years, and in keeping with the trend toward emphasizing ARP sculpture, featured 10 works in stone and 18 in bronze, but only 9 reliefs. In Judd's estimation, ARP's work is nearly always good, and so the exhibition is. He then focuses the remainder of his review on the sculptures and the elusive quality that makes them so special, a quality difficult enough to verbalize that the only 2 sculptures mentioned by name in the review are the ones Judd disliked. These 2, and in fact, well, what I'm showing you here, this is a stone version of Sculpture Classique, and it was actually a bronze that was shown at the Janis show. Judd commented on these 2 works, the least likable sculptures are the few which actually resemble the human body. Sculpture Classique is obviously a standing figure, although smoothed and without feet. Demeter is also insufficiently changed. The problem with these 2 works is not so much that they're representational. As Judd explains, ARP sculpture is always based on the body, but there is a big difference between an approximation, a description, and the more frequent oblique reference. Instead, the problem comes up when a sculpture's dependence on represented bodies as subject matter leads ARP to sacrifice its wholeness as an object in favor of an emphasis on those parts that make it recognizable as a torso or a kneeling or crouching figure. And as Judd insisted, a good piece by ARP is a whole which has no parts. Judd didn't single out a work in the exhibition that met these criteria, but I'd like to offer another work you've already heard about this evening, Torso with Buds, which has disappeared over here. It was going to be over here. It's the invisible Torso with Buds. Let's see if, oh, it also disappeared from that one as well, the official photo. That's all right. We've got enough torsos to deal with. We're talking about this work right here, which, as has already been mentioned, some 4 years after this exhibition, Patsy Nasher walked into the Sidney Janis Gallery and bought this work as a birthday present for her husband, Raymond Nasher. It was the first work of modern sculpture that they purchased, and it's the founding work of the collection. And because I do happen to see it when it's installed in the galleries, I see it all the time. I've had a lot of time to think about and look at this particular work with Judd in mind. In the Janis exhibition, Torso with Buds was installed, as you see, near the doorway. So anyone visiting the show would have been seeing it from different angles as they came and went through the doorway. Now, technically speaking, Torso with Buds is, in a way, nothing but parts. It's conjoined ovoids, basically. But listen to Judd's description of a good piece by ARP, a whole that has no parts. And again, the work that is supposed to be shown alongside it has also mysteriously vanished. It is a whole, it's wholly there, it's just the lights have been turned out. I'll go back to this and you can look at this for a moment. The protuberances, this is Judd talking about a good piece by ARP. It's not specifically this work, but when I read this and I look at this particular sculpture, it makes me think that maybe Judd had a work like this in mind. The protuberances can never be considered other smaller units. Even partially disengaged sections are kept from being secondary units within or adding up to a larger one. This lack of distinct parts forces you to see the piece as a whole. the wholeness that most of the sculptures have, come from the passionate sense of a body. The perception of its wholeness dominates its parts. This seems to me a terrifically perceptive assessment of what goes on in a sculpture like Torso with Buds or many other sculptures by Arp. To begin with, in this work, Arp makes a body whose wholeness comes from the limits he places on it. The bottom ovoid is cut off cleanly. It rests flat on the ground, or in this case, its little pedestal, which Arp and Judd would have disliked, but it keeps it from getting knocked over. And the tip of the top ovoid is, Arp has attenuated and slightly curved, a trajectory that subtly closes off the possibility of additional upward growth. The buds that branch off likewise come to smaller, slightly duller points that arrest and contain this spark of growth. Looking at this piece, what strikes me about Judd's passage is his phrase, the passionate sense of a body, not the body. That is, this sensation of wholeness that he's describing arises not from one depiction of the human body being more abstract and thus more successful than another. I think Judd is making a more radical distinction, that the sense of corporeality, of bodiliness in Arp's sculpture that it can convey results from Arp's creation of a body that lives vibrantly within itself. This distinction between the and a helps us understand Judd's next comment. Because of the sensation of sensuous wholeness, Arp's work is never unspecific, although it is unusually general, even empty in a way. According to Judd, Arp's work is sensuous, whole, and general, as far as its subject matter goes. To Judd, it's empty of the conventional associations of subject matter, general as a body, but always specific as an object, specific in the holistic integrity that Arp's passion has brought to its creation. And it's because of Judd's concern with wholeness that he appreciates the smooth, seemingly untouched surface of Arp's sculpture that so put off the abstract expressionists and William Rubin. In the last sentence of his review, as if offering a rejoinder to them, Judd stated, because of the sensation of wholeness, the sensation of the surface is highly developed in Arp's work. The single surface dominates the distensions and indentations. Judd's thoughts about specificity and wholeness in works of art would find greater expression in an essay he published the following year, Specific Objects. Sorry, there we go. In Specific Objects, which dealt mainly with contemporary art, Judd wrote of works that were neither painting nor sculpture nor hybrids, but completely new forms. As was the case with Arp, or the best of Arp in Judd's opinion, the experience of a specific object was an experience of wholeness that dominated the various aspects and materials of its creation. And I need you to imagine Torso with Buds, right here. It's upward form, the two buds. I'm sure it's embedded itself in your mind by now. As Judd wrote in Specific Objects, in terms initially formulated in his text on Arp, it isn't necessary for a work to have a lot of things to look at, to compare, to analyze one by one, to contemplate. The thing as a whole, its quality as a whole, is what is interesting. Judd's thoughts about Arp attest to the unexpected afterlife artists and their works can enjoy. And it's a larger arena, I think, than one circumscribed by the concept of influence. Artists don't always respond to artworks or anything else in straightforward or easily predictable ways. And it can be difficult to recover what an encounter with an artwork meant to an individual artist. Most of them do not write as extensively and beautifully as Donald Judd did. We should also not underestimate the importance of the artist's living presence, if only through his work. When Judd praised or de Kooning criticized Arp, they were speaking of an elder, as someone still alive doing what they do, still making art capable of surprising, engaging, or irritating. Arp visited the US on a few occasions after World War II. Not speaking English, he didn't mingle easily with others, as Duchamp did. But his living creative presence was important nonetheless, and his death in 1966 marks the beginning of a new chapter, the passage of his possible impact into history, another sort of relationship to the past, but one still marked by encounters above all with his work in all its varied and imaginative forms. Thank you. Are we taking some questions? I'd be happy if people have questions. I'm trying to. Gareth?
Oh, well. I was impressed in the papers there that the art that you had shown from, was it 1916, seemed to me to be very influential on late Matisse cutouts. Much more interesting to me than anything that art might have influenced in America. I just mention it because it seemed that. And Donald Judd's assessment of art is an excellent assessment of his own work.
Sure.
We have to say.
Yeah, it's very much, and I mean, you know, Judd may be an extreme case, but I think artists usually do that. I mean, they're not disinterested observers, and I think Arp especially his work really lends it to being interpreted in all kinds of different ways, and in ways that art might not necessarily have liked or agreed with either. The Matisse Connections an interesting question, and I don't know, to be honest, whether Matisse, you know, how much of these works Matisse might have seen. That's an interest. That's maybe the next continent. It's an interesting thought. Any other questions? Yeah.
You know, if the post-war American artists were aware of or interested in Arp's other identity, that is, as a poet, I wondered if they responded to that side of his work in any way that you're aware of.
Motherwell, I think, did, but I haven't come across, I mean, you know, apart from Motherwell, the abstract expressionists were not very interested in, well, they were interested in poetry, but they weren't interested in artists who were writing poetry. You should choose one or the other. And that doesn't seem, Arp was often talked about by historians or curators as somebody who was an important poet as well as artist, but not in a sort of, nobody was quoting his work or talking about it in a really active way that I've found. Other questions?
Did you find any material linked to Ray Johnson? Because that would be interesting.
There is still, yeah, that seems like a natural, and I'm sure it wouldn't surprise me. I haven't found it yet, but there is so much material on Ray and Johnson, and there's still so much sorting through being done in the archive that's yet to emerge. I mean, the good thing about conferences like this is that hopefully they bring more things to light as well. Other questions? Yes, back there.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Oh, thank you.
Your reading of your reading of the Judd review is really fascinating because it tells us what happens to the body in Judd's work, which is really interesting.
No, thank you.
And in that light, I was wondering whether you have found any connections or whether you might speculate about a connection between ARP and artists like Louise Bourgeois or Eva Hesse.
Yeah, I think, I'm thinking for a moment. No, I think there's definitely something to that. I would think more with perhaps Louise Bourgeois because there are probably historical connections to be made. A number of artists working in the mid-1960s around this idea of eccentric abstraction, I think we're very much interested in reclaiming some of those ideas in ARP's work. One of the problems, though, is that ARP was seen, so strongly through his sculpture. He was seen very much as a sort of old master of modernism at that point, that I think it took very specific encounters, or an artist like Judd, who was looking for something very specific. I mean, it's like he was waiting to be hit by a lightning bolt. But I think that's also, in a way, more to come. I mean, I think there could probably be a second talk by somebody else or me, hopefully somebody else, that would follow this trajectory on through the 60s as different types of works begin to sort of reemerge. I'll throw out one example of a work. I still don't know what to do with this, and I almost included it, but I didn't, and that is Dan Flavin. There was a show of Dan Flavin's drawings at the Morgan 3 or 4 years ago, and it included drawings by Dan Flavin, but it also included works from his private collection. And it was a great range of objects. I mean, who knew that he liked Hudson River landscape drawings? But it also included 2 Dada-era automatic drawings by ARP that had been owned by Tristan Tzara, that he bought out of, I don't think he bought it out of the auction that followed his Tzara's death, but probably from a dealer secondarily after that. I really want to know what on earth Dan Flavin thought of ARP. His notebooks are still being transcribed. They're not open to researchers yet. But I think that's an incredible chapter yet to be written in this story. So, other questions?
Thank you so much for your talk. And Judd is a fascinating and was for me an unexpected place to end. And I wonder, given and illuminating one, I wonder, given Judd's own interest in the interactions between art and design, the ontology of a chair, and mass culture, whether there's anything to be said about ARP's influence on mid-century American design and so-called organic design and the kinds of kidney bean-shaped and surfboard-formed objects which we surrounded ourselves with. Of course, Judd does make chairs, ARP, to my knowledge, doesn't. But I'm curious about that way of rapidly absorbing art in the so-called applied arts.
Well, 2 things with that come to mind in terms of design. I think in part that is what I was referring to as a sort of the ARP effect. Like even by the point of mid-century design, ARP's work was so well known already to a couple of generations that it's sort of, you can't necessarily pin one. I mean, you'd have to do, I think, far more historical research to pin down an intersection between this designer and particular works. And I think also in relation to that question, also, whether Sophie Teuber-Arp had any, that's also another question of influence. And I think this second question about with Judd is interesting because as much as he very much liked Arp's work, especially the sculpture, you get the impression that he's a little ambivalent about the reliefs. He writes in a couple of places about these being the kind of works you see everywhere, and I think it's in the reliefs that you see much more clearly these sort of the silhouettes of these forms that become, these sort of kidney bean or naval shapes that become. Arp's reliefs didn't engage Judd in quite the same way that his sculpture did. Although I think they were really important to him as he was thinking about what can a work of art look like if it's not on the wall, but it's not a conventional sculpture. Other questions? Yes. Well.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I think it was a fascinating talk, and I just thought how lucky we are that you're specialist in Dada as well as abstract expressionism, because that combination really gave this deep, deep insight into the effect of art on the art world in the 50s. And I have to say, I was quite surprised how wide and also how prominent the circle of artists is which engage with art in the one or other way. And thank you so much. It was a fantastic start.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for all of you for coming this evening.